To talk about her creative journey, I welcome to the Drawing Inspiration podcast, Anna Gibbs. Hi, Anna. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thanks so much for having me. Real honor to be invited.
Well,
I'm super excited.
I'm excited to have you on. I've been following you for a while on Instagram, and when I found your work, and you were talking about working with gold, and I was blown away by that. And we're going to get into that a bit later when we talk about your techniques and that. But the fact that you've spent so much time drawing the birds and the animals that you do, I'm taken aback by that because that's what inspires me is nature and the way that you render it and the way that you do it. I need to know more because I need to be more like you when I start getting into working with oils and that. So I really want to hear kind of your perspective and your side of it. So I want to thank you for because you're on the other side of the world. So I appreciate us being able to find a time that works for you and to be on the podcast. So thank you.
Yeah, no, absolute pleasure to be here. Yeah, I'm based in New Zealand, but originally from the UK, just for people who are confused by the accent and location
Yes.
being out of sync.
So I always like to begin, as I always do, with understanding where you came from. And obviously, we're going to reach back to England on this one, but I know that you've
Yeah.
traveled around a little bit. But I'm wondering, were you the artsy child? Were you the creative child, or did it hit you later in life?
Yeah, so I was born in London and I am from the UK originally. And before my mum had kids, she was an artist for a while. So my household was always very supportive of creativity and art, and she sent us to art nursery school. So in that sense, it's been there from the get-go. But I was also quite an academic and nerdy child. So I think that my dual identity in my childhood was very much extremely creative, but also quite academic. And yeah, I think that split and kind of being torn between those two was a real story of me navigating my identity and what I really want that I'm sure will kind of continue to come up throughout the theme of this discussion. But yeah, I was always making art as a young child. And then all the way through kind of primary school and high school, continuing to do as much art as I could and like got to do lots of different sort of I don't know what subjects you have in Canada or all the different countries that the people who are listening live in, but in the UK I did like textiles, so like silk painting and
Hmm.
sewing machines and that kind of thing. Design technology, which is like building stuff with wood and metal and more like skills as well as creativity, I suppose, in creating physical stuff. And then the traditional kind of art that you would imagine where you do pottery and drawing and painting and all that kind of stuff. And then as I got to my teens, I think there was more pressure on me to decide whether I go down more of an academic road or a creative road. And in the UK, you get very highly specialised in your last years of school. So for me, I mostly went down the academic road, but I did art in addition to my school subjects as an extra subject in my free time. And then in the end, decided to go for the academic university route. So yeah, basically from very early on, I was always making art and always wanting to spend as much time as I possibly could making art. And yeah, it was a real passion for me.
So before you went to university, did you like what was your focus with the art that you were doing? What was inspiring you? Because now it's obviously nature is driving that. Was it that at the time as well, or were you influenced um, by comic books or Disney or like was there something else, or was it nature back then as well?
I think for me, there's definitely an element of nature. I remember like in periods of kind of stressful times in my life I didn't really notice this pattern when I was a child, but looking back, I would kind of go and draw outside with just a pen and paper or pencil and paper, even when I was, maybe like around the age of 10. And so I think nature was always something that was soothing to me, and then I could sometimes combine that with my art. But in terms of what I was spending a lot of time doing, it was making all kinds of different creative things. I liked making creative cakes that were like looked like a rabbit coming out of a hat, or like Noah. I did my granny had a birthday and I did Noah's Ark, so I just built a cake in the shape of a boat and then made all the little animals out of icing. Um, And yeah, I did a lot of design stuff in school where, you make like clocks, or I made like a doll's house, or like I just wanted to make anything creative. It wasn't really just about the more traditional forms of art. I think just any time someone gave me the opportunity to do something where there was a creative window, and I'd push the window. Like I got taken on like a school trip for history, and then got told as the homework to, write about my experience, and I just drew a picture. And that's it.
That,
Luckily, the teacher was up for that because she displayed them all, and then the picture went in the middle of the display and made it look a bit more jazzy. But yeah, and like doing English, would be told to like write out poems, and I would just do masses of illustration around them. And um, I think I was really open to kind of any kind of design, illustration, cake baking, whatever it was. Just room to be creative. I really thrived in.
that's awesome that that you explored it all and that you had that your mom was an artist and encouraged all that as well because I think that's fantastic. Obviously, it served as a good foundation for you into going to
Yeah.
university. And was it easy for you that you had to pursue art um, into university? Was like was
Yeah,
there
so
any other choice?
I think basically, again, I don't know. I think in the US particularly, the way university works is it's much less specialized. Like you just go to a university, and there's a lot of scope to do lots of different things when you get there. And in the UK, it's much more focused. So you tend to do just one subject at university. And if you do art, you go to an art college or university. And if you do maths, you just go and do maths. And if you do English, you just go and do English, or whatever it is that you specialized in.
Hmm.
Um, so I went to university and did philosophy, politics, and economics as my degree. So that's the subjects I was technically studying and ultimately examined in. But while I was there, I kind of approached the art school that was tied to the university and asked if I could use, the art facilities and go to some of the classes. And I was really lucky in that they were very open to that. But I mean, the art communities often are, so it's not that surprising. But they let me kind of come to particularly the more traditional classes, which are the ones that I wanted to go to. So I did a lot of life drawing and still life and that kind of thing. Because I think for me, I wanted to really just make time in my schedule to make art. And I really enjoyed doing that kind of life drawing stuff when I was in high school. And so the opportunity to continue doing that and to push myself, I guess, a little bit out of my comfort zone was great. And the tutors in those sorts of environments are quite kind of, they'll critique your work and give you feedback, and you can learn from it. And then I think in my own like free time on my own, I could be making like anything creatively. But I liked that school sort of setting for those more traditional techniques. Um, yeah, so I did sort of continue with it at university, but it wasn't ever an examined part of my course or anything like
Okay,
that. Technically, it was all academic focused. Yeah.
interesting. So you didn't actually go to art school, but you benefited from art electives that were on campus or nearby.
Yeah, and I guess what was unusual then is that the only instruction or kind of influence I was getting was self-selected modules in very traditional areas that were very skill-based. So I think if you go to art college, you'd obviously be experiencing a lot of stuff that was pushing you into more conceptual art, or art that's connecting with your emotions, or like these different pathways of conceptualizing art and thinking about it. And for me, because of the way that I kind of sided into it out of my academic degree, I only did the more traditional skill based elements. And for me, I think a lot of it was just setting aside time and space that was completely for art and completely for creativity. And I wasn't looking really to get anything out of it other than that, for like just doing it for myself, really. I certainly didn't think I was going to be an artist. So that wasn't no way the game plan and the kind of purpose behind it at all. But we had like a tutorial system for our university teaching. So again, like I think it's different at different places. But at my university, it was in kind of you on your own or with one other student with a professor for an hour for each subject each week. And so if I was setting the time for the schedule for my tutorials, if I said that I was doing this kind of life drawing class or something, then the professors were happy to accommodate that and to move the class time for me to allow me to go to do it, which was really great and really nice. And so yeah, it was by having that kind of fixed structure around me attending the classes, it kind of meant that I could make sure it happened. And I think otherwise, there was a lot of things I was up to and busy doing, like clubs and societies and all sorts of things that could easily have eroded the time that I would otherwise spend doing more of the traditional drawing and art and creative things. So it was really great to be able to do that.
And I found it interesting when you talk about this on your website that you were able to find that connection between philosophy and
Mm.
art, and it's just so interesting that you were able to embrace the two and pull them together in a way that is meaningful to you. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I had never heard
Yeah,
of
yeah.
Kant before,
Um,
so I was like, wow, this is
Well,
cool.
it's interesting. I mean, like I find that sort of writing the about page of a website is like a horrific thing to do because it's like, how do I say things in such a brief and written format with no emotion? And yeah, expressing what I want to say. So I mean, that was really me kind of talking a little bit to the relationship between philosophy and art in my mind, but I think it's much bigger than that, really. And my whole journey towards becoming an artist is born out of the more academic stuff that I studied at university and that I chose to study at university because I'd been thinking about it a lot. And it's a real area of passion for me, and particularly really the philosophy, but also the politics and economics kind of come into it because there's a big overlap. And these are subjects which are asking us like these fundamental questions about the nature of reality and why humans collectively act the way that we do and structure the things that we do and value the things that we do. And the kind of Kant part that I referred to on my website is really the area of philosophy that's specifically thinking about art and what is art. What is the difference between something being man-made or being artificial? What is the difference between something being art and nature? Like, if there's a rock on the ground outside, it's probably not art. If we put it in an art gallery, is it art? If we put it in an art gallery and spray paint it, is it art? Like, where's the line? So these kind of philosophical discussions around what these concepts are and what they mean to us as people and why they matter is aesthetics, and that's an area of philosophy in its own right. But for me, I think these fundamental philosophical questions about why we choose to do the things we do, what the purpose of things are, what the nature of morality is, what makes us happy, what makes us thrive, what gives life meaning and connection is born out of this kind of more academic philosophical exploration. And the answers that I have come to those questions is a big part of what motivated me to really change up my whole adult life towards becoming an artist and living in a different country and having a completely different mindset to what I value, what I do, what matters to me, what I want to say with the time that I have here and the way that I connect to other people. And my art is totally driven by all of that, really. From me kind of living a life where I am meaningfully creating things with my hands that I find I have a strong kind of sense of purpose to me thinking about nature and the importance of nature, and particularly the nature that's specific to New Zealand is really fascinating. And I could probably talk for an hour about that, and that's probably not what people want to hear right here in this space, so I'll refrain. But being able to put that in front of people in this country and outside of this country and give it a voice, shine a light on it, show people the value that's there. And our kind of economic political systems don't always value nature as much as I would like them to, as much as I think would, in the long run, for humanity's sake, be better. And so it's a big part of the motivation for the subject matter that I choose to kind of look at in the paintings that I create, as well as the kind of the specific Kant reference on the website is about the idea that creating something visually that connects with the people that then look at it in an emotional way is the primary purpose of what we're doing with art. And so if you make something that when people look at it, they sort of feel joy and see something beautiful and it's connecting with them in that way, then it's kind of doing its job essentially as art. And that's the primary function of creating a visual representation of anything, is to kind of create that connection with the people that then subsequently look at it. Um, but yeah, it's a bigger picture. I think that relationship between philosophy and art for me, in terms of my whole story.
Well, it's I've never heard someone kind of uh, assemble that marriage, and I think it's a really
Mm.
interesting way to look at it. And even in what you were saying there, it was like, oh, okay, that I need to I need to put that into my mind and process it a little bit because I think that's a really interesting way to look at. I mean, I think it's obvious that we create art to generate emotion and generate connection. And I always tell people that there's a story in what you draw or paint, and the story may be something that people inherit based on the images that you've put on paper, but or canvas. But there's also a story as to why you've chosen those, and I think people need to hear both, right?
Mm.
And that does help to contribute to this emotion. You do something, oh, that's beautiful, or that reminds me of whatever, or that's so cute, or it made me laugh, or it made me cry. I think that's where we struggle as artists is being able to generate that emotion because otherwise it's flat, right?
Mm.
And I love this connection. I'm gonna have to go. I was before we spoke. I was trying to read up on Kant, and it's like I just don't have the mind space for this right now.
Oh no, 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 no! You can't. It's not something to dip into, that's for sure.
Right.
Um,
So I will,
yeah.
I will take this point to kind of remind people that there are really good show notes, and they'll be along the in the bottom in the description for the YouTube video. But they will also be on the website as well. So things like Kant, I'll point to, and some of the
Yeah.
other items that we'll talk about. I'll provide links to everything. So I just want to remind the listener and the viewer now that's where you can find that information. So I I just I'm curious about what happens next. Like, so you're going through philosophy and your degree, and then you're dipping your foot in this extracurricular activity to kind of that you feel a need to do. When you walk out of university, what are you thinking at that point? Are you thinking I'm an artist now? Or are you thinking I got to get a
Mhm.
job? Like,
Yes, yes, exactly that. Like, oh my goodness. Okay, right, real world. Here we are. I need a job. Someone's got to pay me so I can live. And yeah, so I mean, when I was at university, I kind of did the academic stuff and I did a lot of art. And I think when I look back over my life, I, however much I sidelined art, it like pushed its way back in. And that, I suppose I thought of it as a hobby, but it was like a very dominant hobby that would I would just be constantly trying to make more time for and spend more, energy on. But no, I kind of came to the end of my degree and literally while I was doing my final exams, because in the UK system, it's like all just your whole degree is decided by your final set of exams. Like whether you pass, fail, have a degree or not, you just sit a whole bunch of exams and are absolutely terrified. And then you find out whether you've got, like really good degree, no degree, somewhere in the middle. And during that process, I kind of interviewed for a teaching job because one of my friends doing my course was interviewing for a teaching job and was like, "Oh, I think that this could be a good thing for you to try and do." And I thought, "Yeah, sure, that sounds good." And yeah, then I kind of got that job, so I fell into teaching. I was actually teaching economics, just to clarify, not art, because sometimes people just assume I must have been teaching art. Um, and I really enjoyed like being part of a school, teaching. I think it's something which I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And having gone to school, everyone kind of gets what school is. And it wasn't too different or intimidating. And I think I really liked that there wasn't the same structure as a lot of office jobs. Like I did internships for, like 6 week periods in the summer and stuff in office jobs. And I really struggled to make it through the 6 weeks. Like, sitting in front of a computer all day, being told that the like boxes on my PowerPoint slide were 2 millimeters out of line with each other. I was just like, this is not, I can't do this for the rest of my life. I'm going to struggle to do this for 6 weeks. So I think I realized I needed a job where I was on my feet and it was a bit more open ended as to what, like, this is the goal we're trying to achieve and the job that you're doing, but it's not like micromanaged, prescriptive form filling. And teaching seemed like a really good option for that. And obviously, there's a lot of creativity at teaching, like you stand in front of a classroom and you've got to get what's in your head into the head of the kids in front of you, hopefully with a bit of enthusiasm mixed in. But there's a real open sort of range of how you might want to approach that. And I really enjoyed the creative challenge of how do I structure lessons and ideas and communicate them. And I created like little activities. And I say little like as if they're children. There's like 18-year-old kids that I was getting to like cut out little flowers and stick them on charts to represent the flower market to get an idea of supply and demand. Like, but I really enjoyed that. And it was amazing working in a school, working with young people. I'm still really, really passionate about the academic subjects that I studied. So, it wasn't like this wasn't something I was interested in focusing on. And then, yeah, inevitably, I was still doing a lot of art in my free time. I was living in a house share with people. I lived with a friend initially, and then moved into a house share with people, and it's like a 5 bedroom house in the middle of London with 5/6, 7 plus boyfriends, um, people living in it who are all like in their early 20s, like something out of a sitcom. And I had sort of taken over the kitchen with my acrylic paints and canvases, which was the phase I was in at that point. And I just my really great friends who I still love to death were incredibly accommodating of lifting up canvases off the oven so they could make pasta, putting them back again, and like the fridge was like a drying rack, and and then like they'd go on a night out and come back, and everyone would do sort of 3 a.m. painting abstract, and they kind of embraced it, and were really patient. And yeah, but I think looking back, I could see, it was just fighting its way into my life the whole time. And I was never really going to get away with not doing art in a big way. And then I sold everything that I could find lying around in my cupboard on eBay and scraped together some money to buy an iPad with an Apple Pencil. And that was a real game changer. Because then I could make art anywhere, anytime. I could be super creative. It could be illustration. It could be more traditional. It could be drawing what's in front of me. But I did like a lot of traveling in the holidays when I was a teacher, and I could take it with me. And I still cling to my iPad and my Apple Pencil desperately. And it's a big part of even how I create the oil paintings that I do now. It's still integral to my process.
That's interesting. We're gonna have to dive into that a little bit deeper too. I do have a question for you about teaching. Did
Yeah.
anyone ever submit a piece of art like you did for their homework?
No, actually, that's interesting. No. I think by the time you're doing, because this is the last 2 years of school in the UK, and this I was teaching in a very academic school, so there was a lot of focus on the exams and stuff. I think that was probably like when I submitted that piece of artwork, I was a bit younger. That was like when I was in my early
Come
teens.
on, people need
The
to.
academic pressure. I don't know how I would have responded. I probably would have been like, "Yeah, that's really lovely and great, but you do actually have to do the essay. It's quite an important part of the course."
Right.
Um, but yeah, no, I think I talk to my students a bit about art in lessons, just kind of casually. And I did kind of go into the art departments of the school sometimes and do a bit of art, but I never really managed to make that stick because I never ended up just being too busy when I was at work, and then I just make art when I got home. Um, and I encouraged everyone who was interested in art to explore that and be creative and be a bit fearless in their creativity and not let it die in the face of them being under academic pressure. But
Right.
yeah, no, not
I
not.
think that would be like it would just be. I'm glad that you shared that because I think back when I took economics in high school, the people that taught me economics, I think if they told me they painted, I would
Mm,
have just lost my mind because it. I didn't
yeah,
enjoy the subject as much as you do, and the teachers that delivered it were um, not that interesting. And so I'm glad that you at least were able to weave even the idea of cutting out flowers and things like that in what you were doing as a better teacher. So I think
yeah.
that's kind
When
of cool.
I was at university, it's actually one of my politics tutors. I had tutorials in his office at another college, and he would have like a drying rack across his office with these like paintings with clips hanging on them drying. And to begin with, I used to be like, oh, he's like maybe he's got a kid, and because they were quite like childlike drawings. And then over time, I was like, oh, I think he's making them. Like, I think he just is, this is something he's doing for fun, and he's putting that out there. And I think I was lucky that the kind of intellectual environment, for all its pros and cons, was really open to that. It was, that level of eccentricity, you might call it, or just people being creative, was definitely not looked down upon. It was definitely not seen as a bad thing. But yeah, no, for sure. I think I hope that my students, thought it was nice that I was a three-dimensional person who did more than just teach them. And actually, one of my ex-students reached out who was following me on Instagram and said, she's thinking about switching careers and going into art and wanted to talk to me. So I did like a Zoom chat with her. And if anybody else out there wants to switch careers, I'm like, so my friends, joke about me being like, it's like some kind of cult. I'm like, yeah, do it, quit your job, do something creative, follow your dreams.
Right. Don't call me if it fails, though.
Mm. No, no, dude, there's no failure. There is no failure. That's the thing. I think there's a lot of constraints and there's practicalities, and you've got to be able to eat and support yourself financially and not be driven insane by the anxiety of making all the ends meet in life. But beyond that, the metrics of failure in terms of judgment of other people is something which I think it's really important to notice, but not let it stop you. Because I mean, when I started out doing art as a full time project, I nearly quit so many times because I was like, oh no, I failed. This is a disaster. I can't do this. Like, I'm kidding myself and this is a joke and I need to go back to doing something boring that I don't love as much. Um, and I really am glad that I pushed through that. And so I think I kind of, again, like anybody out there who's at that point now, just don't give up. Do hang in there, even if you have to go back to maybe doing it part time if there's pressure on you from other angles. Don't let the dream die completely and think that you are not good enough, because I like so many people on Instagram talk about talent, and even now I'll get people who'll like message me and they'll be like, oh, you're so talented, and it's like, not really. Like, I really don't, I'm not a big believer in talent in that way. I think talent implies that someone is born with an innate ability that other people aren't, and I just don't think that's true. I think there's so much scope in art to do different things. Some of those things are more skill based than other, but the skill based things are skills you can learn and you can get better at. And yes, if you want to do realism, then you need a really high skill level, but that is mostly born out of spending the time doing it, not being born with an innate ability. And if I show you, things that I used to paint, they're a lot worse than things I paint now. And that's because, like, now I've had several years of just painting, like, I don't know, 60 hours a week sometimes, 30 hours a week, probably more often. And you get a lot better. And it's not about I'm born with enough talent or not enough talent. And that narrative is really destructive and making a lot of people unnecessarily kind of feel like there's a barrier that they can't climb over, or there's obstacles that are stopping them from pursuing the things that they feel is passionate and kind of meaningful. And yeah,
Yeah,
anyway, rant over.
that's okay. I totally agree. I've had other guests on talking about talent as well, and I do agree with you. I think talent's a myth. I think the thing that we need to embrace, that does make a difference, is that curiosity that we have as a child. Because I think all kids are curious in what interests them, and we tend to lose that as we get older, right? We think we're being more practical, and we tend to lose that curiosity. I think we don't. What we don't have as a kid is we don't have the tenacity to kind of focus on something and spend time at it. We don't have that. When you're a kid, it's like, I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to go over do this thing. We tend to get better at that as we get older, but then we start to lose the curiosity, the willingness to try and have fun and all that kind of stuff. And I think I would agree that talent isn't there, but I think there's parts of us that contribute to creativity, and sometimes we end up pushing those too deep, and we don't discover them till later. I didn't start painting and drawing until I was 40. And so I hit it real deep. And it wasn't until I started drawing with my daughter that I realized, wait a sec, I think I can actually draw stuff, and then exploring it. And so I think the words that you just shared about talent and about sticking with it, and if you do something, because I was always concerned about, if I'm still concerned because I'm nearing retirement in my day job, that if I become a full-time artist and I don't make money at it, does that mean I'm a failure? And I think it is that kind of flip-flop to say, well, maybe just not now. So bring it back to part-time, rescale it, just stick with it, because it's not always about selling your art. It's about that journey that you personally have between the beginning of a piece and the end of a piece that you can't share with anyone else. They can see the beautiful piece that you did on gold with these wonderful, beautiful bluebirds and hummingbirds and that, but that journey is yours and will only ever be yours. That endpoint they could see. And I think it's important that we embrace that it's not about selling a piece of art for $1,000, $2,000, $10,000. That helps, but there's a much more to it, and we have to make sure that we embrace our creativity as humans, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm in danger of being too philosophical the whole way through this conversation. Please call me out if I do. But like, from the kind of what I studied at university and my interest in the more philosophical side of asking questions about economics and politics and philosophy is that money is like a means to an end, I suppose, in my mind. It's like a system that we use in society for exchanging things and valuing things, and it's also a form of validation. So for me, selling my paintings and getting money is a really good way for me to justify carving out the amount of time and energy I do for painting them and making that kind of a legitimate, justified process. And I think that's kind of a big focus for me in terms of how I see the money making part of it, is that I want to be able to sell them so that I can justify spending enough time making more of them. But I think that the pressure in society is quite, it's like a, I don't know, like infectious and addictive, and you can get really sucked into this seeking of validation without realizing you're doing it. It's like just part of being human, that we're all susceptible to it, and especially on social media you can find yourself starting out thinking that you're just sharing your art and you're not worried about what other people are going to say or think, or whether they follow you, and then lo and behold you get sucked into it and you start getting a little bit obsessive about, I need more followers and I need to be selling it for more money and I need to be like more validation, is how I would see that in my mind. And so it's kind of keeping that in check, and again me like noticing when I've been sucked into sort of, as I would see it, validation seeking, and trying to then step back from that again and park it and move away from it, and creating the paintings because it's a process that I enjoy, that's meaningful for me, that I'm saying something that I think is an important thing to say in society. But it's a really, really vulnerable thing to create art, and so it's not surprising that that urge to seek validation gets tied to it quite heavily, and can be quite powerful. And but not, I don't think it's a very constructive force, and it often leads us to trying to create things that our heart's not really in it. Like if we see an avenue where we're like, oh, but I'll get more followers, more money if I do this other thing that's a bit different than what I actually want to do, you then can find yourself getting pulled away from the reason that you set out to do it to begin with. Um, yeah.
Yeah, it's very well said. I and the algorithms, social media platforms are built around
Oh
that, right?
yeah, so bad. They're just there to exploit you. Don't worry, Instagram, I love you. I'll say lots of good things about how you've facilitated me living my dream as an artist, and I'm incredibly grateful. And I think social media is really can be a power for good. But yeah, you just have to be wary of that particular aspect of it. Yeah.
Well, I know that people will, when people hear this, they will have already known, but I did move my newsletter and everything to a different platform, to Substack. And I sent out a message to all my current subscribers to say, I'm doing this. This is why I'm doing it. And I lost like 12 people. And it's like, and there's always these measures in place to help you make you feel worse about yourself, right? And you just have to shrug it off and think, that's okay. I want to speak to the people who want to hear what I have to say. And we have to be mindful about that always, right? It's a lot of positive talk needed when you're dealing with Instagram and everything else out there. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
So, on the kind of the money bit, the economics and becoming an artist, at what point did that happen for you? Like you were teaching, did it go
Yeah.
from teaching to artist? Like how did that transition happen?
So it's so funny because like for me, it's my whole life story really is all tied in together, and so it's how that unfolds in the conversation that we have. I guess. But for me, a big chapter or avenue that we haven't really come across yet is that I struggled loads with my mental health. And I think, you know, one of the reasons I studied philosophy at university is that I had real existential angst. Like I had a real disconnection from meaning and purpose, and why I was living, and what I, you know, it just didn't seem tangibly meaningful to me to be alive when I was a teenager and in my time at university. And I had a lot of mental health challenges, and it wasn't until I was in my early 20s as a teacher that I then was brave enough or educated enough to bother to pursue help and get help for that. And I did get help and I got a lot better, but it was over a long period of time. And during my 20s, I did a lot of therapy and I was on antidepressants for a while. But that process of really dealing head on with my mental health and getting it to a much, much better place led me to start to connect much more with who I am, like the core identity of what makes me me, and to be more self-accepting of that. And therefore able to connect with asking myself, what do I really want in life? What is meaningful to me? And I think that led me to realize the answer to those questions was largely making art, spending time with people I love, spending time in nature, and living in the middle of London. There were a lot of obstacles to me spending more time making art, spending more time with the people I love, spending more time in nature. So initially it was just me going down from a 5-day-a-week job to a 4-day-a-week job to make more time to, spend more time in nature, spend more time with people, spend more time making art for fun. And making, I sold the odd piece of art to a friend, or I did loads of like digital drawings, kind of illustration-y drawings for friends who were having kids, where I would like do a kind of kid style drawing and then have the date of birth of the child and their name and then frame it. So like when I was a kid, we'd get these like little cross stitch things that people made with our date of birth on them,
Right.
and then I still have them from when I was born. Um, and then COVID hit and I was pregnant, and this all happened fast. And so I had kind of planned to take time off, obviously, with the baby and be on maternity leave. In the UK, it's kind of standard to take a year, especially if you're a teacher. It's easy for the school if you just do your academic year and they just get someone to fill in for that academic year. Um, and then my husband was going to take some time off from his job and we were going to come out to New Zealand because my parents had already been living here for a really long time. And that spiraled into like full lockdown in the UK. I gave birth with COVID. So like, people in hazmat suits in the hospital being like,
Oh no.
oh my God. And this was like the first April of COVID. This is when it was like kicking off. No one really understood it. Everyone was a little bit like in a state of panic, basically. Driving to the hospital through the middle of London, there's like no one there. It's like something from an apocalypse film. It's just like, my husband's like, where should we park? I was like, just pull up the car in the middle of the road. I don't think anyone's going to do anything about it.
Right.
Yeah, we just thought, let's go to New Zealand. I had residency because my parents had moved there when I was a child. So luckily, very, very luckily for us, we had the right to enter the country, and we got on a plane and came to New Zealand. And then we just thought, actually, do you know what? We have been through this process over the last few years of reassessing what we value in life. We're now parents, and we don't see a way of it working, living in London, working as teachers in schools, that we can kind of get the time that we want as a family, get the opportunity to be outdoors a lot. And living in New Zealand, near where my parents are, we could be, as we are now, living in a kind of semi-off-grid lifestyle block, as they call it in New Zealand, which is like a small mini farm, like a large garden / small farm. Like 3 chickens and 2 cows situation. And we collect all of our water from the roof. It's just rainwater collection. We don't have any mains water. And yeah, so we have our little piece of paradise in the middle of nature, and we are not constrained by the financial challenges of living in the middle of London with massive mortgages, etc. And I can therefore have a go at pursuing art, and especially being on maternity leave, I think I found that a nice little window where it's so scary, as you say, like to kind of put it out there as like, I'm gonna do this, and then oh my God, I'm maybe gonna fail at this by whatever metrics of failure you've set up for yourself. But being on maternity leave, I was like, well, I can always write it off as like something I did on maternity leave when I would have been working anyway. And it gave me that excuse, I suppose, that allowed me to be a bit braver in the face of having a go at being a full-time artist. And then the local rural community out here is like a lot of artists, a lot of really wonderful, supportive people. Somebody local offered for me to do an apprenticeship with them. I had honestly never really painted with oil paints. I mean, maybe for like an hour once back in school, but like I had no idea where it was going with oil paints. And as I'm sure, it's not new to the conversation or podcast, it's quite a scary thing to jump into oil painting. It's like, it seems intimidating, technical, messy, toxic, like, So I just went to her studio and she kind of got me started. And then I bought my own set of cheap beginner oil paints and went from there. But it really transformed the quality of what I could create. Like suddenly I was like, oh wow, there's a reason everyone who does oil painting does oil painting, and that it's been going for as long as it has. It's so versatile, and it's so, you can paint with it with fast drying mediums and it's almost like using acrylic, or you can use slow drying mediums and blend everything into infinity for months on end, or you can, which is more what I do, use kind of translucent layers that you build up called glazing. And it's almost like doing digital art, where I don't know, some of you listening will probably do digital art where you create everything in layers. So you have like your drawing layer at the very base, and then you're building up the colors and then the highlights and the lowlights and the, you know, detail and everything on top, on top, on top. And I think that's how I approach oil painting. It's more almost like my digital drawing than acrylics. Um, so yeah, I can't even remember what the original question you asked me
So
was.
I think you got to where we wanted to be, because I think
But yeah.
so your journey to being an artist is fairly new.
Yeah, no, that's why you couldn't find me on YouTube.
Yeah.
So I became a full-time artist. I can mark it by the age of my daughter, so like 3.5 years ago. I was doing it part-time, and as you could tell from what we've talked about so far, kind of constantly doing art in some form or another in my free time throughout my whole life. So I think in that journey, I'd actually developed a lot of skills and things that I bring to the art that I produce now. But in terms of it being my main like job, focus, whatever you want to call it, yeah, no, not a huge amount of time at all. And that's where I think I have to credit social media as being a big component in what has allowed me to get where I have in the sort of short space of time that I have. Um, because yeah, again, like having not gone to art school, it's not like I have a lot of connections in the art world, and having moved countries, it's not like I have a lot of connections at all. um, but I have a local community of people who are incredibly supportive, and yeah, like a local artist who kind of got me to come into the studio, and she's a phenomenal oil painter. And then the local sort of community run not-for-profit gallery let me exhibit some paintings there, and then, you know, it just gave me a little beginner platform to start off, a springboard. And then I got into doing Instagram, and I think I took the Instagram quite seriously because I did not have any social media accounts. I mean, I had a Facebook account from when I was at university. I guess I would have signed up to that, and I had, you know, used Facebook as someone who uses it to kind of connect with friends a bit, but not very actively and not regularly checking it or anything. And I'd never been on Instagram, if I'm honest. I still have never been on TikTok. Like, I have ventured briefly into Twitter and been quite intimidated. Um, but I yeah, didn't know what I was doing, but that meant that I was actively researching and educating myself on how to approach social media. And I did a course with someone who's based in LA on Zoom, who kind of taught me how to make reels and how to approach it, and her advice for growing your account. And I think what I really liked about it, it wasn't, this is how you use Instagram to make money as an artist. It was more like, this is just how to use Instagram as an artist to put your work out there and connect with other people and make what you're doing connect with the people who are looking at what you're doing. And then my Instagram account started growing, and getting a lot of people following it and interested, and more opportunities kind of came out of that. So yeah, it's been a exciting few years, basically. Yeah.
That's awesome. I'm so like I'm so happy for. I didn't realize it was such a short period of time, but your work is
Mm,
incredible, and I would think that you've been doing this for
yeah.
you know a decade and a half at least. Like it looks incredible, and so I think that's wonderful to hear that. And mental health challenges, it hits us all. I think it's something that we do have to talk more about. That we have to seek the help when we need it. And I struggled a lot as a teenager. Some of my best friends had no idea. I told a friend of mine, uh, so I'm 56 now, and I told him about, I don't know, 6, 7 years ago about the things I was thinking about and the stuff that I was
Mhm.
going through. He had no idea because, you're teenage boys, like, "Roar," and you're going
Yeah.
out and doing this and that. And in inside, I was dying inside. And so, it is a struggle, but I'm glad that you mentioned it because I think it's important for people to hear that. And sorry, I was leaning back on that because it really hit me personally. Um,
Yeah.
but I wanted to jump ahead again to your art and your work because you were one thing that struck me is the idea of when you had your first child. I don't know if you have more than one, but that choosing to do oils when you have a young child is probably the hardest thing to do, and versus drawing or colored pencil or something like that that you can just work on and leave and that kind of stuff. um, but you said that the person that was tutoring you had their own studio, so you could go there and do that. Was
Yeah.
that the way that you were able to get through that?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, it was very much like I was really thrilled that someone had reached out to me and invited me to come and work in the studio with them. And then I could just go to this other place, and there was in front of me brushes and paints and palettes and someone to answer all the questions I had about, oh my God, what do I do? And someone to help me know how to tidy it up and what to do with the brush at the end of the day. And like it just all that intimidating uncertainty and expense was removed for a period of time. I got to ride the bike with the training wheels on, and that was just an unbelievable gift that they gave me. And then once you've ridden the bike with the training wheels on, like taking them off and continuing to ride the bike is just way less of a terrifying prospect. And it allowed me to also learn and realize what I could do with them, what doors were opening, and that was super exciting and very motivating for me to then kind of continue to pursue that on my own.
It's amazing. I still haven't tried oils yet. I had a guest come on and she sent me a whole bunch of oil paint and all the tools, and I just haven't started yet. I feel like I'm a bit of I guess a perfectionist, where it's like I just need the right time. I need some time to do it because I know they take a while to dry, but I kind of want to get into it, spend like a week doing it. And I intended to do it this summer, and life got out of hand, and I just didn't have a chance. So I still want to get to it. So I'm really anxious to hear from you. Like, what if we can talk about your tools? I mean, your medium of
Mm.
choice now is oil. Like, are you 100% oil?
Oh yeah, 100% oil. I
Okay.
mean, so as I said, I still use digital art. So
Yes.
um, I do digital kind of drawings, and yeah, I suppose in my mind I create digital art that is my sketchbook. So from like the very large quantity of bad ideas, I mean, I don't actually think they're bad ideas. I'm being stupid, but the large quantity of ideas I have, some of which I tend to continue with, and some of which I tend to not continue with, and progress into being actual paintings or get parked. I do all of it on my iPad, and it was a real learning curve. It's almost as a bigger learning curve learning to draw on an iPad compared to pen and paper or pencil and paper, because it's like it feels very different. Like if you imagine like running something smooth on glass, you don't have that friction of a pencil and paper, which like is such a core part of how you instinctively draw. And I've been drawing for years, and decades that my entire life I've been alive. So learning to adapt to that was a really steeper learning curve, but I had no pressure on me, I suppose, at the time I was learning that. But I guess all the different mediums that I've explored in my life, I just see something that I haven't done or that I don't do as like things that you don't do seem intimidating and difficult and potentially almost impossible from the outside until you learn how to do them and have go. And then suddenly it's not as difficult as it seems. Even like learning to use a new piece of software on a computer or learning to use Instagram for the first time. Like you look at this from the outside and you're like, oh my goodness, how am I going to tackle this? This seems like beyond me.
Mhm.
Like I'm not a social media person. I can't do this. But actually, if you take it step by step and you reach out for help from other people who know what they're doing and you listen to that help and aren't afraid to have a go, usually everything I've ever then made myself have a go at has worked out, and in hindsight seems much simpler and more straightforward than I anticipated it would be. So I guess I have this sort of blind faith going into something. That like if I just throw myself into it, it will sort of not be as mystifying and complex as I anticipate it will be. And so far, that's largely worked out to be the case, including with oil painting. But yeah, it's just got to go for it.
Yeah, it is a process, and I know that I've talked about the fact that almost everything I create, there's a point where it's ugly and I hate it, and I just
Oh yeah,
I don't want to do this one
always.
anymore. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm done with
always.
you. And then I think what I've learned is to push through that and just
Yeah,
observe the process. Even when I'm looking at some of your pieces here, I think the part that stands out to me is the depth that you have in how you've rendered a lot of the birds that you do. And so that's a tricky thing to do, I find, because I'm trying to do it, is to achieve that depth. And when I say depth, I mean that, when a bird has its wing, and is trying to clean itself or whatever the case, and some of the feathers are sitting much higher than the others, and so they
Hmm.
project a bit more shadow than the others, that you've really nailed that. You get this sense of depth, not through color, but through value, and you're able to achieve that really just brilliantly with oil. And I really enjoy looking at your pieces because there is so much depth to them. There's so much, you really play well with value. The colors are amazing. But I'm really enamored by the values that you've been able to render, and I think that kind of stuff takes a lot of time. And it's back to your point about looking at something and going, I don't know how
Yeah.
to do that. People could look at that with a wing that has 60 feathers on it and think, how am I going to do the shadow so strikingly on those three versus the other ones? And it's just a matter of breaking it down, creating a process, and then building it up again. And you've done it well.
And I think that whilst oils seem intimidating to get going with, they're then easier to create the outcome you want with. Like, and I've listened to some of your other guests talking about, their transition into oils and their frustrations with acrylics. And I literally was speaking to another New Zealand artist recently about this, who's an acrylic painter, and you can kind of get frustrated by the limitations of other mediums that aren't oil painting, whether it be like watercolor or acrylic, or because they are more limited. But with oil painting, there's more scope for it to do what you want it to do. And so, like you were saying about the values, for me, it's something that I've always found a bit intimidating. When I was at primary school, I did a painting of a flower pot, which was like one of the first sort of color paintings I did in a school setting that a teacher was assessing, and the value was so bad. I mean, it looked terrible. Like the kind of form of it was fine, and the tones of the colors were okay. They weren't great either, to be honest, but colored people also used to being quite forgiving with. But the values is what makes something look like real or not real. It looks like the thing that you're representing, or it doesn't. Now sometimes it's intentional. People aren't making it look like the thing that is in front of them. But if you wanted to make it look more of the realism kind of genre of art, the value is absolutely critical to that. And for me, when you're painting with acrylics or watercolors, I'm really not knowledgeable about watercolors particularly, so forgive me if I get that wrong. But you have to try and nail it from the beginning, because if when I was painting with an acrylic paint, if I get it slightly wrong, then I've just got to go over it. And yes, it dries fast, you can go over it, but that's quite a time-consuming, frustrating process of like going over it and going over it. With oil paints, you can build. And so I guess a lot of the digital art that I did allowed me to see this way in which you can just keep tweaking rather than writing over from scratch. And so if I did the shadow under a wing by kind of mixing the paints so that they're slightly darker color to represent the light, and it wasn't dark enough, then I can put a translucent layer of black oil paint mixed with a clear oil medium, very thin over the top. And if it's still not dark enough, once that dried, another layer until I get the tone that I think represents how the light should look.
Hmm.
And I can see what I'm doing as I'm building the layers, and I tend to do everything in quite incremental bits because I know it's easier to kind of add a bit more than take it back. But it's that flexibility with oil paints, and that's why I love glazing, like building these layers, because you can do a layer and see how it looks, and do a layer and see how it looks, and then you decide when to stop. And it's like less of a commitment, I guess, than I found acrylics. Like you have to, there's such a commitment to every mark that you
Right.
make, because usually, I mean, I didn't ever build up layers when I was painting with acrylics. That was it then. And if you're not 100% happy with it, you just sort of feel a bit frustrated. Whereas oil painting, you can just keep like editing and amending and slightly adding and slightly adapting and slightly changing. In some bits, I just paint over the whole section because it's disaster. That still
But
happens, but less.
you must get to a point where you look at a piece and you're trying to, make lift the wings off the paper by throwing a shadow below them, and thinking, if I just did this in Procreate, I could add a layer, and I can just play with the opacity until I get it right, and it saves you
Yeah,
like 10 or 15 steps. It's completely different, but it's the same approach that you're
yeah, it's
doing
the
where
same
you're,
approach.
yeah,
Yeah. And I
Right.
guess what I'm doing is I'm adding like 5% each time
That's
of the
right.
opacity
Yes.
until I'm like, oh, it's 45%. That's the right amount. Like,
Exactly.
and it's not, I think if you always tried to do shadow through that glazing approach, you could end up with the tones of your colors going a bit too gray.
Hmm.
Sometimes particularly depending on like if you've got some of the birds that I paint have feathers that are quite metallic, and so when the light bounces into a shadow, you get quite a vibrant color, but it is still in the shaded part of the bird. And so then I'm quite careful to try and get a vibrant tone of the color and not have black translucent layers on top of it. But that I just learned through experimenting. It's just like learning basically and having a go and adapting.
Yeah, and I think that's where I think a lot of starting artists gets struggle a bit is that they tend to look like if they're using a reference photo, they treat it just as a reference photo. Like they're trying to replicate that. And what photos tend to do is they kill the shadows, they kill the detail. And it's being able to expose that as an artist. So you can use a reference photo, but it's being able to understand that if you just put black under where the wing meets the belly, it's going to be black and it's going to look flat. And so being able to, as you say, look with the way you're doing it through glazing, you're able to then incorporate the color of the wings on the belly, as it falls under as it falls under the wing, and still respect that without it going completely black, right? And that's I guess a wonder and a wonderful use of oil, but it's something that I think a lot of people fail on is they just go too dark. Like they want to, especially even in watercolor, they want to use a black paint or they want to overuse like a Payne's gray or a neutral tint, and then they kill the color that was there, and it's unfortunate. But yours are just like you could see the details sitting under the wing, you could see the color that's sitting in the shadows. It's brilliant.
Yeah, and I think something which I because again, just stop me if I start going too heavy on the oil painting here, because I'm worried that we're going to end up losing people who are just not into oil painting. But when you're painting with oils, something I realized and I learned a bit when I did the apprenticeship, was when you put one color on top of another, it's not the same thing as mixing those two colors together and then creating a new, that color of paint that is then mixed together. So if I have black and then I paint like a translucent blue over it, versus if I have white and paint the same translucent blue over it, that what it looks like is wildly different. And if I have a bright blue and then I paint translucent blue over it, it looks even like a third different way of looking at it. And so sometimes with some birds, I will start with black gesso as the background and sketch in white, and then paint from the black up to the highlights. And other birds, I'll start with a white background and then kind of put in both the highlights and lowlights as I go, depending on what the image is and how it's going to come out. Thinking about when I'm looking at like let's say a reference photo, if like I've been painting some flowers as part of the painting I'm working at the moment, where you can imagine the leaf of a flower is slightly translucent. Imagine like a really bright pink flower that's slightly translucent, but it's got like an outer layer of the petal that's a bit like got some like white detail like on it.
Hmm.
If I'm describing this very well.
Yes.
But so what you're really looking at as a human being is light coming through the petal that's making the pink glow, but with a more opaque dots of white sitting on the surface of that. And so for me, creating that, I think about, okay, well, if I have like the white background of the gesso with some translucent pinks that represent that light literally going through it, like the light in the room of the painting is going to go through the pink paint that's translucent, hit the white background and bounce back through it. So it's like looking at pink stained glass with a white background behind it.
Hmm.
And it's going to like have a slight glow quality that represents the sunlight coming through from behind. But where those white dots are, it's a bit more opaque. So adding those white opaque dots as more opaque white paint at the end, not perfectly white because it's actually a bit grey, but like recreates the way that the light's working in real life, that gives it a much richer quality than if you just were to paint like pixel by pixel the exact color, like for like mixing the paints as you go. So for me, I think thinking a lot about how the light moves through the layers of paint that I've created and what it's bouncing off in the process of doing that has really helped me improve the quality of the images that I'm creating. And yeah, it gives them that like added, just less flat, I guess I'd call it, like added richness.
And I'm sure they're much more brilliant in person, but New Zealand's a bit of a drive for me. So,
So far.
so the thing I want to ask you about is your tools that you're using now. I always like to kind of venture into this. Let's save the gold for a little bit later, but
Yeah, that's a whole thing.
But I'm wondering, like, do you work on birch board? Are you working on canvas? Maybe let's start with that.
Yeah, so I work on board. I know some artists that use gold that work on canvas. I'm really nervous of that. Sorry, it's a fly in my face. Um, and I'm nervous of that, I think, because for me, I like, especially with the glazing and everything, I'm very wary of like there's a lot of layers. Like from me priming with a lot of primers through to doing the gold process, through to painting on top of the gold, through to the glazing on top of that, through to be varnishing. Like there's a it's not ever actually very thick, but in my head I'm just very wary of all these layers, and that the flexibility of canvas makes me nervous. That if in the future someone somehow was that canvas was to stretch too much or move too much, that those layers might crack or they might be compromised. So I liked that a board is more solid, and that gives me. I'm a bit obsessed with how like archival you might call it, but how like long lasting the physical object I've created is the more colloquial way of thinking about it. And I think that for me, after the research I've done for what I'm creating, I like the idea of a physical bit of board that I painted on top of that I can protect very thoroughly so that it's UV proof, waterproof, humidity proof, relatively heat proof. And you know, when we've all died from climate change, my paintings will just be floating in the middle of the ocean, totally unharmed. But yeah, so that was one of the reasons for choosing board. The other one is that I mean, I've always really liked working with wood. When I started 3.5 years ago, I used to use like native woods from old pieces of furniture that I would then cut like a bit of wood and sand it and do like a woodworking process. So I'd take an old bit of wood from like a tabletop, cut it down to size, sand it back, varnish it, seal it, like treat it as an object almost. And they were quite thick pieces of wood that were quite heavy, but the paintings were very small. Um, and then transitioning from that into more like just commercially available wood, which I have to confess is, you know, not ideal, but it's more practical using like more modern forms of wood board. But I think I got used to painting in oils at the beginning on this very smooth, highly sanded wooden surface, which is very different from canvas. When I've like dabbled in a bit of canvas, like the texture of it really throws me off because I'm not used to it. And I imagine if I got used to it, I'd probably get into that. But
Mhm.
I like having my like perfectly smooth surface that I'm starting with, and then any texture that I want, I'm intentionally creating on top of that, rather than being feeling like I have the texture of canvas as a starting point that I have to kind of commit to.
And how many, like, whether you're going black or white gesso, how many layers are you putting down?
Ah, yeah. So, right. I start with, I've got, for the people who are listening on audio, I will do my best to describe, but I have brought a couple of things with me for show and tell for the
Okay.
video. So, sorry, everything's like industrially sized for me at this point because I'm producing quite a lot of stuff. So, this is what I call GAC 100. I don't really know what the, like, if there's a more technical name, but it's produced by Golden, but I'm sure there are other companies that produce it too. And it's just a primer. So, it's an acrylic primer that's going to take the wood board and it's going to make it like waterproof, and it's going to adhere very well to the wooden board, and it's going to adhere really well to the gesso that's then going to sit on top of it. So it's
Mm.
like almost a glue between the gesso and the wood. And so I start out with that. I use rollers for my priming instead of brushes because, again, I'm obsessive about the textures that are underlying my paintings, especially underlying the gold because it will show every bit of texture. So if I do brush strokes for priming, the gold is going to show those brush strokes very clearly. So yeah, rollers, put that on, 3 very thin coats if I am time rich and patient, 2 slightly thicker coats if I'm in a panic. And letting them dry again between the layers, and then gesso on top of that. So the gesso, I will normally do white gesso or black gesso, and if I want a colour that isn't white or black, I will do white gesso and then put an acrylic colour on top of that, for like changing the tone. Or I will do the gold, then oil paint white, then oil paint a translucent colour, then the bird. So it just depends really.
Mm.
But yeah, it's very like some art that people create and that I have created in my life is very free flowing. You just sort of start with a canvas and something happens, and mine is like methodically planned. Like it's like these are the processes, and I don't think of it that way because the process is happening the same every time. So for me, it's just a process rather than a plan. But when I start telling other people about the process, I've come to appreciate quite a pre-planned structure of like, this is what this part of the kind of process needs to be in order to create the ultimate outcome I want. So yeah, and then gesso, like any gesso, I mean, I just use, again, like industrial size pots of gesso that I get from art supply stores. And then, yeah, the gold, I will, so yeah, again, like I'm kind of wary that almost maybe no one listening to this actually uses gold, so there won't be
Yeah, I
that much
think it would be good to
interest.
maybe explain why
um,
you chose to do it, and then
yeah, okay.
how you buy it, how do you apply it. Maybe you can talk about that.
Oh yeah. So, the deciding to use gold, I think a lot of experimenting and ideas, and I tend to find I have like hundreds of ideas, and then some of them stick and most of them don't. And the gold, it was an idea, and it's one that I stuck with. So I was really interested in, kind of as we were talking about, how the light bounces through the paint, and obviously if you have gold and then you put translucent layers on top of that, it's very different because it's super reflective. So you get loads of light bouncing back. And I was quite interested in exploring that. And that was maybe like the kind of starting off point for using the gold. And I was using silver a bit at the beginning as well, which removes the yellow tone of the color, obviously. But it's silver is, it tarnishes a lot. Like, once, this is the thing, metals are like a whole other material to get your head around. But for me, I was like, again, another thing I don't know about. Let's just learn it, and I'm sure it will demystify itself in the process. So yeah, gold and other metals that you could apply to something like board is actually a really ancient technique of what is called gilding, and the people who do this in the world of applying metals to things. And you have these really, really thin sheets of metal that I don't make at all, that you buy. And then you transfer them onto the object, and then they cover the object. So if you look back at like historical frames or pieces of religious art, or you can see loads of examples where in history people have made objects or paintings using this technique, and it can make something look like it's made of solid gold when it's not. So if you like have something that's gold plated, that's essentially the same thing that I'm doing. But I'm just doing it to a flat surface, so it becomes part of the image of a painting. Whereas you could do it to a three-dimensional object like a frame, and it'll look like it's a frame made out of solid gold, when actually it's just a thin layer of the metal on top. I use 24 karat gold, which is basically just the purest form of the actual metal gold. And one of the reasons that gold historically has been very valuable to humans is because it's completely inert, which basically means it doesn't react with anything. So if you leave it in the sun, in the ocean, mixed in with some acid, like, you can do whatever you want to it, and it's not gonna impact the gold. The gold's not gonna have a chemical reaction. It's not gonna tarnish, it's not gonna discolor, it's not gonna like suddenly go orange, like, other than the color of the gold. Whereas most other metals, like, so classically copper, I imagine even if people don't realize they know this, they will know this. So if you have something that's copper and over time it oxidizes, it goes green, and you can often see that like turquoisey green alongside copper, because that's the natural process that copper will change color to. So using 24 karat gold, one of the things I liked about it is that it doesn't really matter what materials I use it with. I don't have to overthink that, because it's gonna like be completely unreactive. So it's very safe to work with, as long as I'm doing a process where it's securely adhered to the structure underneath, and the paints, oil paints, well, just normal oil paint with normal oil paint mediums will go straight onto gold very happily, as long as you let your oil paints dry and cure properly. Then adhere to the gold, so you've got a sort of strong permanent structure there. And yeah, so I was interested in the light kind of playing with the gold and reflective surfaces of the metals. And then I think also for me, my parents have been involved in conservation in New Zealand for a long time, and it's something therefore I have inevitably come to know about, because I don't know if anyone has parents who are interested in things, but attempting to not know about the things your parents are interested in is a battle that you might be struggling to win. So it was infectious, and I kind of became interested in that too. And I wanted to kind of use the art I was making to shine a spotlight on the native birds in New Zealand, of the kind of environment here, of the conservation efforts. And from my philosophical, economicsy, academic background, the concept of where we place value in society being like, we value money and we value gold and we value jewelry and we value crowns. And there's this core identity in Western society, but to us, all societies pretty much globally, not just Western, that gold and jewelry and money are really valuable things to us. And me, I think there's obviously this equivalent significant value in nature. That like there are so many unique species in New Zealand, many of which are in danger of becoming extinct. And if we don't recognize as a human society the value of these and prioritize that in the way that we do things, we will lose what those amazing unique species are and what they have to offer, and the beauty that they represent, and the history that they were, you know, the magic, as I see it, of them. And so it's like taking this thing, which is gold and beautiful oil paint colors, and people go, oh, that's beautiful. Like, I recognize value in this because that's what we've kind of culturally have come to identify as being valuable. But then they're like, what am I looking at here? I'm looking at a native bird of New Zealand. I'm looking at nature. I'm looking at, and then they're like, oh, but that is really beautiful. And so I'm trying to create this connection, I suppose, where people have this emotional response to my paintings, and they're unifying this sense of value, importance, and beauty between gold and kind of colors of gems and jewelry and these, you know, man-made things with nature and the representation of what I'm putting into the kind of imagery of the concepts of my paintings. So yeah, I think that was the thinking behind creating the images that I have, which are these bright colors sitting next to gold that are very jewel-like in their imagery.
So when you're putting the gold leaf down or the gold down, are you having to set that with some paint or something to seal it to work on top of, or do you go straight to oil?
Yeah, so again, this was like, so as with starting anything new, I think it's always good to just find a way of doing it that you feel, you know, able to have a go at, and then adapting that. So I just started out with processes where you have quite a simple application of a special substance that's like, it's just, there's so many different ways of doing this. I'm trying to generalize, but basically you get an appropriate substance that you can buy, you put it on top of completely dried gesso or acrylic, either is okay, and then wait the appropriate amount of time at the appropriate temperature, which all sounds mystifying, but it's honestly no more mystifying than like baking a cake. Like, it's just time, temperature, like following the recipe on the instructions of the thing that you bought. And then much more difficult is transferring the physical metal onto that, which is fiddly. You're dealing with something insanely and intimidatingly expensive, which is why, like, at the beginning, I, you know, used silver that's less expensive, and I played around with imitation gold, although some of the cheaper metals are harder to work with. So it's a weird sort of balance of like, it's less terrifying because it's a cheaper material, but it's actually then more difficult to do. Whereas the pure gold's the most forgiving by far. And then, yeah, you just apply it, and then you're good to go, really. You just oil paint straight on that. And then you need to like not get oil paint onto the gold, because if you do, the oil paint's quite heavy. You either have to commit to that mark being made, or you have to make that mark into something. Or if you try and lift it off, the gold will come off. And if you patch up the gold, you will see the patch. Like, when you apply the gold, you can't, like, it's very, it's not a forgiving substance. Like, if you try and change a bit, you'll be able to see very clearly where you've patched it up. And so, yeah, it's probably the more difficult thing to kind of get your head around.
So you basically turned it into a watercolor painting at that point.
Exactly. Yeah. So no more scary than a watercolor painting. Precisely. There we go. But I'm too terrified for watercolor painting. Right. I'm like, how do people do this? Every mark you make is like there forever.
Yeah.
But yeah, I suppose
I'll just wrap my boards in gold and I'll go that route instead.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
but you get used to that quite quickly. Right. Just careful.
So when, like, obviously we're going to think this is expensive. Like, can you give us a sense of for a certain size, like how much it is?
So I used the first pieces I started out doing were 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters. So like pretty small pieces of art. And doing one of them was, so this is where we now have a lot of currencies to play with here. So like 200 New Zealand dollars, which would be about 100 UK pounds, which now I'm dangerously unaware of what the exchange rates would
So I
be,
think
but
we're usually,
US dollars?
I'm not sure about US dollars. Canadian dollars, we're
Canadian dollars?
usually
Yeah.
double US pound or British pounds. So
Oh, perfect. So same as New Zealand dollars.
yes.
Yeah, so like 200. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Oh, that's easy. I had no idea. That was
For
basically the same as New Zealand.
yeah, I think I mean, and 200 Canadian dollars, you're talking 150, $160 US.
Yeah, yeah,
So that
exactly.
would
Yeah,
be 30
that
by
sounds about
30.
right. Yeah, one
Okay.
layer. And one layer, you're going to have holes in your layers. One layer of very thin gold leaf, there's no way you're going to get it to perfectly cover every little
Oh,
patch of
so
that.
how many layers?
So if you're working with 24 karat gold, you can just patch up the layers and it is forgiving enough that you probably won't see it, as long as you haven't taken any gold off. So you've just like, sometimes when you're applying the gold, it'll float away. It's literally like two demonstrations, there'll just be like gold flying everywhere. But yeah, if there's a little gap, let's say between two bits or a bit that like didn't get down, then you can just put another bit on that and it will, like if you put a layer of 24 karat gold on top of another thin layer, it will literally like glue back together. Like the gold is so soft as a metal, it will
Right.
just, as long as you apply so a bit of pressure, like you need like the equivalent of baking paper, like you get these wax little sheets of paper that it comes with, but you don't obviously want to just put your finger on it and press down. You want to like put the gold down and then the wax paper on top and then rub on the wax paper gently, and that will like stick it down. um yeah.
I'm not so scared of oils now that you're talking
Yeah,
about
it's
it.
the thing. And like people are like, oh, but if you tell people how to do it, then like, isn't that giving away your secrets? And I'm like, oh, that is just not my philosophy at all. Like everything that I have learned from other people out there. There's nothing that I do that I have invented from scratch. Like, so it's just passing on and sharing knowledge and the tools and skills of creativity. I think there's so much value in people being open and making them accessible for other people to have a go at, but definitely doing the kind of working with metal and the gilding part of it is a real learning curve. It's not very straightforward. Like oil paints, I really encourage people to just be brave, go in, do it. You will find it so much easier and more thrilling than you expect. But yeah, I would think very carefully about doing the kind of gilding stuff, unless it's something that you are really interested in pursuing, or just do it in a very free, fun. Don't expect the first few times you do it for it to work out how you imagine it will, and be prepared to use a lot of materials in a very open-ended way, and it'll look how it looks. um, but yeah, it's a steeper learning curve and a more stressful one just because they're quite expensive materials to be working with, so it's a bit intimidating to be playing around with. Whereas again, in the oil paints, I know someone else, I think on one of your podcasts said this, but like really high quality oil paints are great, but also really not very high quality oil paints are almost as great. Like
Right.
I use really high end ones because I'm doing what I'm doing at the level I'm doing it at, but I started out with just student quality oil paints, and it's not a dramatic difference between them and really high end ones. Like don't I've had people ask me, is it better to go and buy a small number of colors of really high quality oil paint, or to go out and buy lots of different colors in a lower quality oil paint? And my personal advice would be to buy more colors in a lower quality oil paint. It's some limitations in being a less good quality oil paint, but mostly it's much harder to mix exactly these like vibrant colors and different colors that you can buy than it is to kind of recreate the quality impact, like the texture and tone of the colors that are from the more expensive paints. And some of my favorite colors, because like if you buy like Viridian Green from different brands and different qualities within each brand, they do look slightly different. And some of my favorite ones are like from the less fancy ranges. Like some of the super vibrant, really lovely, rich colors I still use are from like lower quality ranges of oil paints.
Hmm.
So yeah, I appreciate there's a lot of people who probably really disagree with me on that. So
Well, it's
I'll just put
funny.
that as my suggestion.
It's funny you mentioned Viridian green because it's my least favorite green. But I think I should have led with that. Um, and I think it's just because what I create where I live, it's not as common a color. When I look at the stuff that you're doing, I see it much more often, but that's
Mm.
not the stuff I'm creating. So I'm typically looking for, the more earthy greens, a hooker's green, like things like that, right? So, but
I
I,
just it's such a potent green.
yes,
You can always tone it down, but trying to mix something to be more potent is, I find, very difficult to
Yeah.
achieve. So
Yeah.
I like super potent paint colors that I can then I can bring them back down a bit.
So, I often see you painting with a really tiny
Oh
brush.
yeah. I've got, for people who are on the visual watching this, I've got some here to show you because I get asked so much about this. But for people who are listening again, I will do my best to describe what I am holding up. So these are my brushes. Again, I'm one for the, like, you see the little, okay, for
Yes.
people who are watching, there's little red bands around the top of the brushes, and the ones with the black bands around the top are the higher quality, real hair versions that are like insanely expensive, and the ones with the red bands are cheaper. And I would advise, or at least for me, using slightly less expensive brushes, albeit these are still not that cheap. But then feeling less stressed about, like, if I wear the brushes out pretty quickly, which I do, then I get through quite a lot of brushes. And often what I'll do is I'll like do the really fine details with a fresh brush that's in perfect condition, and then if it's getting a bit worn out, I'll park it. And then when I'm doing something that's like a less detailed layer of glazing, I'll go back to my slightly worn out brushes and
Hmm.
use them for that again. So they kind of, the brushes get downgraded in their in their status over time until they're like, okay, this one's, well, actually, I say this one goes in the bin, but sometimes if I haven't managed to screw them up by letting them dry with too much paint on them, the really frazzled ones are great for doing like the texture of moss or something. So like I did this really big painting with loads of moss in it, and like doing the highlights on the moss, you kind of want like a few different hairs
Right.
just that have gone totally static. So yeah, that's my brush journey. But yes, they are these very small brushes. I tend to use Da Vinci Micronova is what these are called,
Okay.
because these are the ones that I can get in Christchurch, New Zealand, where there is very limited options available. New Zealand also doesn't really have online shopping in the way that most of the Western world has kind of created. So for me, the local art supply store in Christchurch is like, I get what they've got, and if I want something else, then I've got to import it from another country, which is a bit of a project. The I held up a packet that had 4 paintbrushes in it. In that packet of 4 paintbrushes, there is a range of sizes from 170-5/0 to 170-20/0. And really, you'll notice that the number that changes there is the one just before the /0, from 5 to 20. And as that number gets higher to 20, the brush tip gets smaller. And the smallest one they make that I have come across is the 20/0. And that one I use for my really teeny tiny details. And if it's not small enough, then I will get scissors and cut it down,
Nice.
make it smaller. But yeah, they are like very, hold up to the camera. That's gonna be out of focus. But yeah, really small brushes. And I obviously do work a lot with bigger brushes for the base layer of things, but I work a lot with the smaller layers, and sometimes for the feathers on the bird, even though I'm doing glazing, I'll start with a small brush for even the basic layers, because when you've got lots of translucent layers with that tiny hair texture in them and you
Hmm.
build it up, you get that richness of like just loads of little lines going back into the depth of the paint, like behind one layer, and that like that sort of texture, it comes across as detail, and it looks realistic and interesting, and it means that like there's inevitably going to be slightly different colors in the paints in the different layers and slightly different mark making, and you get that uniqueness to every like little tiny area of detail of the painting, where otherwise you could end up with a section which looks a bit repetitive. And I suppose real life birds are not, you don't tend to get that sort of real uniform repetition.
Right.
So yeah. And what's hard when I created Instagram Reels is that me painting with my tiny little brush in tiny little sections of the painting doesn't, even if I did like some time lapses, you'd have to watch time lapses for an insane number of hours to get like any kind of impact of like me actually creating something. And so what was really clever that I learned on the course that I did is that I will just do like snippets over time
Right.
rather than time lapses, and that works a lot better. But what you do lose as a result of that is the glazing. Like, you can't really tell, I don't think, from watching my reels in Instagram that I am glazing, because you never see the progress of layers being built up. You kind of just see the progress of me moving across the image.
Right.
And when I've tried to capture that, it looks like the image isn't really changing. So yeah, it's hard to convey that, but that's okay. Like I don't think it matters too much. People seem to still enjoy what I can offer them in the content of the reels that I create. So,
And your reels are brilliant. So if anybody wants something,
but I'm just following someone else's recipe. As again, like there's no, I don't claim to any kind of genius in the approach that I'm taking there. I just did a course and I followed the instructions of that person, and I look at what other artists on Instagram are doing, and I am just following the recipe of creating a reel. Um, yeah, which has, so far worked pretty well.
can you speak to the glazing and
Yeah.
maybe how you do it, how you do that, and more specifically, like what material you're using to do the glazing? Like how are you mixing it
Yeah.
into the oil paint?
So, for the glazing, the kind of basic idea is that you take your oil paint and it comes out of your tube. I use glass as my like palette, uh, just partly because I had it to hand, and I really like that. It's like yeah, I can just scrape the paint off once it's dried and then use the glass again, and it's a really smooth surface, and I just like working with it. I found if I use something that's like papery, it'll absorb some of the oil out of the paint, and that drives me insane. And I just don't really like plasticky stuff as much as I can avoid it. So I find glass is really nice. So I put a little bit of my paint onto the glass, and then some oil medium, which is literally just like what oil paints are is pigment, which is largely traditionally powder form mixed in with oil of some kind, like linseed oil, or it could be like liquid is a really common one that artists use, that I use a lot. That there's loads of different oils out there that people use. You could literally use vegetable oil, but I imagine it would take an insane amount of time to dry. So don't just get vegetable out of your cupboard and start mixing it with paints. But yeah, if you buy just go into an art store and buy like oil for oil paints, like oil medium is what it will be called. There's loads of different ones to choose from, and the things to think about when you're choosing one is like, does it have any color to it? So like liquid's got a slightly yellow tinge to it, the traditional liquid original. And some of them are more clear, some of them are more yellow. And then think about how long it takes to dry. So like some of them are slow drying, like linseed oil is quite a slow drying one, versus some of them are quicker. Some of them have more viscous and some of them are thinner. So if you want to do really detailed bits, I like to create a texture that's almost like ink, like very thin but quite opaque for very detailed bits. And then if you want a kind of thicker texture, that can be fun to work with as well, for kind of different stuff you might be doing. But yeah, you just play around with them, like, or just talk to the person who, is in the store. So it's the real life shopping experience. If you're going on the internet, I suppose. If you're going on the internet, just maybe get some like liquid original, because that's a pretty safe bet to start out with. It's quite fast drying as well, which if you're not used to oils, is probably going to be what you are used to. So fast drying might feel more familiar to you. And then you put a little bit of that on your glass or palette. Again, if you've watched my reels, you might see sometimes for me I like chug a massive amount, but you might want to start with a smaller amount. And then you're just mixing it in, and all you're really doing is thinning the pigment of the paint so that you end up with a clear oil that has a much smaller amount of pigment in it, and is therefore inevitably translucent or transparent almost, with a bit of colour in. And then when you paint that on top of your gesso to begin with, and then on top of the layers underneath, you're building up lots of layers of this sort of translucent oil paint, a little bit like you've created lots of thin pieces of coloured glass and stacked them on top of each other. Or if you do digital art, thin layers of translucent image in your Photoshop, Procreate, whatever you use, image on top of each other. And depending on the order that you do them in, depends on like what color and tone and the way the light comes through it, and that's the fun thing you can play around with. But like again, if you've done digital art, if you had like a translucent blue layer and a translucent pink layer, and you put them both at 50% like opacity, so someone who doesn't do digital art, like 50% see-through,
Right.
and then you put the blue on top of the pink, and then you swap them around and put the pink layer on top of the blue layer, like they will look different. Like the purple you come out with will be a different purple, and it will have a different feel to it, especially if one of either the blue or the pink is like a paler shade than the other one. And it's the same idea. And again, like people who are not into the digital art, if you imagine having like pieces of see-through tracing paper and putting a bit of color on them, and then putting one on top of the other or flipping them over, you'll get a different effect. And so on the whole, like a good starting point is to put the darker things first and then build the paler colors on top. But you will also find that that's a rule you don't want to consistently stick to. And like I was talking about with the flowers I was painting earlier, um, the kind of grey, like white, but in the shade grey dots were darker than the tone of the pink, even though they weren't on the top because they were more opaque, and that's the kind of effect I was trying to create with the thing that I was representing from real life. Um, but yeah, that is the basic idea of the glazing. And liquid is a good starting one because it dries fast, especially if it's not too cold. Like temperature really affects how quickly they dry. So if I am in a rush to get things done for an exhibition, my husband gets really annoyed because I have the heat up in the room in my studio and it's really warm in there. It's like tropical because I'm like getting everything to dry so I can do the next layer. And if I am working on something and I want to not do any painting for a day because I'm doing something else and I don't want it to dry, then I will like get it as cold as I can. And if it's the winter here, I'll just open the window and shut the door and turn off all the heating to the room. And a really good fun tip is that I will, if I don't want my palette to dry, put it in the fridge or even the freezer. Just the whole bit of glass with the brushes on it
Nice.
just goes in the freezer and it will come out exactly as you put it in, but cold.
So, how do you seal your work when you're done? Are you doing it differently because you're
Yes.
using gold?
So, another tool from my Mary Poppins bag. So, for the listeners, I am now holding in front of you a canister of varnish. It's just a spray on varnish. It's not a particularly exciting one. It is, this particular one is golden as the brand, but there are many brands to choose from out there. It's archival varnish mineral spirit acrylic aerosol. And MSA is how I think of it in my head. MSA aerosol, and I will once the paint is properly dry and cured is the technical term for oil painting. Then put this over in thin layers. Um, you can. This is the gloss one. I like the gloss one when I'm working with the gold because I found that the less glossy varnishes made the gold look a bit flat and it kind of lost its shine. So that's one of the reasons I use gloss. But if you're not using gold, then actually sometimes the less glossy paints can look better. It just depends. Um, but the person I did the apprenticeship with, who doesn't use any gold in her work, she's just an oil painter. She just puts a layer of oil medium over the whole thing, and then just that's it, it's done. And if I wasn't using the gold, that's probably what I would do. And I wouldn't varnish it at the end. I'm really varnishing it because otherwise the gold's just insanely vulnerable to being scratched.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I would say that if you're going to varnish it, that's just like, and all I've really done in my choice of materials is started by finding someone on the internet or someone in real life who's recommended a particular specific product to me. And then I've started with that. And then I've branched out from there, being like, okay, well, so if I find another brand that's exactly the same, that's probably safe, or I could research a slightly alternative thing or go for the glossier or less glossy versions. But I definitely think when it's intimidating at the beginning and there's just too much choice, which is why I'm kind of holding up my exact things that I use. It's really nice to have a starting point where you go like, okay, well they use that particular product, so
Right.
if I go for that particular product, it's probably going to be okay, and then I can feel more confident in exploring beyond that later. So yeah, that was my kind of end varnish, and I will put a few thin layers on because I like that very glossy feel over the gold part of the painting. But you might choose to just put one thin layer if you wanted a different look. And again, you'll like it's pretty easy when you're working with it to get a feel for how it's going to look once it dries. After practicing it a little bit.
What part of your process, and I'll link to your Instagram. Maybe we'll throw up some images here in the video. I'll have to figure out if I do that, what images I include. But I think that would be fun for people watching this on YouTube. The but I'm wondering what is, and I guess there's two words to look at this, but what is the most challenging or frustrating part of the piece that you work on? What is the part that you think, oh, this is the tough part now? Like, what part of your process is really, when we talk about these ones with the gold, which is a lot of your work now, if not all,
Yeah.
what is the most challenging part of the process for you?
Um, so it's interesting what you were saying earlier about like there's always a point in creating a piece of work where you want to put it in the bin, like somewhere between 25 and 75% of the way through. And I think
Yes.
that's still true for me now. No matter what I'm doing, that always happens. And I have these moments of sitting there and being like, what have I done? Why have I done this? This looks terrible. And then, as you say, like learning that you just need to push through and have faith that you will come out the other end and it will look great. Um, and so that still happens, and that's still probably for any one piece of work the point of crisis that's hardest to push through. But the kind of doing the gold now, I've done it so much over more than 3 years that it's quite it's because it doesn't get like any more difficult. You just get better and better at it, and it becomes easier and easier to you. And so now for me, that's the sort of very less stressful, easy to do like process following. Where if I'm really tired or worn out, I don't have much mental energy for whatever reason, I'll do the gold part because it's quite methodical. Whereas painting, the detail is definitely, I need to be able to concentrate a lot more. And particularly when you're painting, and I imagine anyone who does any art with animals is going to find this, or even people, that the eyes, like humans are drawn to the eyes. The eyes is the emotion, it's the character, it's the connection. Is the eye looking at you? It's the person looking at the painting. Is it like shining enough light to look alive, or is it looking happy or something? And like just the smallest marks can make a really dramatic difference to how the personality of the bird comes across, or the image. And so I per square centimeter or millimeter of my painting, the eyes are definitely getting the most attention and the most focus. And quite often I will start with the eyes, actually like less now as I've got more confident, but at the beginning definitely, because I just wanted to like lock that down and be pretty happy with it before I then spent all the many additional hours on the rest of the piece. I think that all the texture of the feathers that's super super detailed, people can like often look at that and be intimidated by it and think, oh my god, the hours, the time, the energy to create those marks is you know, it's a lot. But actually, again, like you kind of get in the zone, and it's amazing how many marks you can make in an hour. Like you can cover actually more than you would think, just sort of more confidently going for it. Um, yeah, so I guess for me that the really detailed parts are where I put more focus, but it's not like I enjoy that any less. If anything, I enjoy it more. It's maybe my favorite part. Um, I don't, I like, I really love going into my studio and painting because I just go into a whole nother realm. And I imagine loads of people who are listening to this feel that as well. Like when you're creating anything, you go in that creative space where you stop thinking about other stuff, or I'll be listening to a podcast with one half of my brain that's totally separated from the bit that's making the art. And I will just be focused and thinking, kind of intuitively connecting, I suppose, with the marks that I'm making. And in that zone where time passes by and slips away, and you just I'm just very content, and I love it and I live for it, and I'm a bit addicted probably to it. If I go and not paint for a while or not do any art, I really miss that sense of being all absorbed in mark making. um, so yeah, it's probably the more challenging in the sense of requiring the most focus, but not in the sense that I don't enjoy doing it.
Yeah, I think I was nodding there, and I'm sure a bunch of people listening to this were nodding as well when you're talking about kind of getting in the zone, losing
Yeah.
track of time, and that's what we all kind of look for, that kind of opportunity, right? To be able to just disappear into it. Uh,
Yeah.
in looking at all your pieces, I need to ask you this because of the subject you choose, or the subjects you choose. What is your favorite bird?
Ooh. um, I like a mum choosing a favorite kid. I'm reluctant to commit fully, eternally, to one particular bird. I think I've just done this massive painting that I haven't put on my website. I think I just posted it on Instagram a few days ago, of kakapo birds, which are, there's only 247 birds left alive. Like they are super endangered, one of the most endangered species on the planet. And they are also just adorable, goofy parrots. They're like these big, fluffy, green, like enormous land-bound parrots that are really comical and really adorable. And um, then painting them is like this insane challenge because their pattern is so detailed, and if you don't like do it right, it won't look like they look. Like you have to kind of get it but it's intimidating, the amount of detail in the pattern. But then like when you commit to that and you do it and then you execute it and it looks cool, it's like, oh yes, I did a thing. That's amazing. So that the challenge and enjoyment of the satisfaction of completing the challenge of painting them is also really appealing. I paint a lot of tui and karuru. Tui are a New Zealand bird that's kind of like the size and shape of like a blackbird, which I imagine most people have blackbirds or ravens or something like that. But they have these super metallic feathers that shine in loads of different colours, and I love being able to play around with all those colours. And they have this cute little white bit in their neck that's quite individual and unique to them that you can kind of add into the character of the bird. They do really cool poses as well. And then the karuru are essentially a pigeon, which is one of the things I like about them, which is like I don't know, again, like all these different people around the world listening to this maybe have different ideas of pigeons, but living in London, pigeons are like like, oh god, pigeons. Like grey, pooing everywhere,
Yeah.
unexciting, like the rats of birds.
Yeah, rats with wings. Yeah.
And so the idea that there's this glorified pigeon that people in New Zealand are going to great lengths to conserve, that's actually is really beautiful. I mean, it does look pigeony, but it also has this metallic feather pattern. Their chests are like bright, rich green colours with loads of pinks and blues, and I really exaggerate and play around with the kind of colours of them. They're really beautiful and they're really lovely. And our house that we bought was named after them, and we have them in the garden all the time. And they also have a lot of character. And yeah, then a quick shout out to Fantails, which are these cute little birds that are like something out of a Disney film. You know, like when the Disney's princess's skirt is being held up, in like
Yes.
90s Disney's princess, for those
Yes.
people who are young, being held up by the birds. They're like those birds. They're like the cute little ones that fly around your feet and come right up to you and are just adorable. They're, you know, they're really wonderful. But yeah, anyway, I will stop because I could keep going for a while. And I think you probably have had enough of a flavour of the birds.
No, it's so interesting. Obviously, it's a unique part of the world, and the
Mm.
birds. You know the what was it, the Kakapoo, um,
Kakapo, yeah,
Kakapo.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
it like I would when I earlier when I was talking about values, I was thinking about that one as
Mm.
well, because the way you've kind of rendered the areas under the moss where you can still see the suggestion of greenery underneath that is the kind of thing that's important in any kind of drawing or painting, that you don't lose that detail, right? And it doesn't get crushed. And I think the way you've done that, I mean, the bird's brilliant, but I, I I sometimes get lost in the branches and the twigs and the
Yeah.
textures that aren't the animal, and I feel a little. I feel like the bird's looking at me like, "Can you give me some attention here?" But I'm just so like, "Wow, look at the way the bark is," and you know, you just get caught up in that bit. And I don't know if you have the same thing the way you.
Yeah, definitely. I think the birds, in order to make them like convincing for people to kind of connect with them as representations of birds, there's a lot of constraints on the imagery, and you can play around with it to an extent, but it needs to be a bird, and you therefore have to plan it reasonably well in advance. And I tend to paint very true to my kind of digital drawings that I've created. But the greenery in the background, I have like a rough plan and a sense of like this is going to be a tree over here and that's going to be some moss over there. But it's a really much freer process. And that big painting that I did had loads more greenery in it than some of the other ones I've done. And it was just like weeks and hours of like, I think being freer in that sense of being in the zone. We talked about that sense of losing yourself in creating work and time passing and you being totally in that space. When I'm doing the really realistic animals, you have to like not get so lost in that because you've got to be concentrating quite hard on making the marks in the way that they need to be made. When I'm doing the background, it's just so much looser and freer and just like I am like covered in paint when I paint. There are like the person I did this friendship with, literally she paints in a room with carpet and not like messy art studio carpet, like just a part of her house that has a lovely carpet and lovely furniture, and she just puts the paint on the canvas and it doesn't go anywhere else. And when I paint, it is like on my face, on my neck, on my hair, on my arms, on my clothes, like the walls, the floor, like, and I would just be, when I'm especially doing the background, like so many different brushes behind every ear and in each hand. And I'm like using both hands and smearing stuff with my fingers. And like, it gets messy, but it's really fun and a really, much freer creative space. And I think I then just go like, I'm just going to make loads of marks and I'm going to do a thing and then I'm going to stand back. And if it's not how I want it to be, I'll then edit it. But I don't feel as constrained, and that's quite fun. And I can see how people could get super into just making really abstract pieces of work, but that's the only process.
That's
Because it's definitely an exciting space to be in. Yeah.
that's cool. Yeah, I'll have to see what kind of oil painter I am. I don't think I'm going to be messy.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I would like to be tidy, and for the purposes of not getting paint on the gold, I've had to learn to be a lot tidier than I would
Right.
instinctively be. And now sometimes I will paint in my like normal clothes, but mostly I'm just incapable of not making a mess. But I'm a messy cook, I'm a messy driver, I'm just like
Messy driver's not fun.
I'm that person.
Okay.
So yeah.
So I always get to the point before I ask people where they can find you, or you can tell people where they can find you is homework. It's always
Oh
nice
yeah, yeah.
in listening to somebody talk about their journey and their pieces and their mediums and their process. And I thank you for sharing all of that. I'm curious what you would share as a matter of homework for someone who wants to leave this video or this audio podcast and want to do something else. What would you suggest?
Yeah, definitely. So again, like everything I do is ultimately been stolen from somewhere. This is homework that I was set in high school by my high school art teacher, who is still like one of the most inspiring teachers I've ever had. And I did loads of kind of life drawing, which is naked people. Um, but you could substitute out naked person with some kind of still life if you want, and do a bowl of vegetables or a vase or anything really. But I did this exercise with a kind of life drawing setting. And the process, I'm going to give you like a shorter exercise to do and a longer option, and you could do both or either depending on what suits you. But in whatever medium of creating art you usually use, whether it's watercolors or drawing or digital art, like anything, you can adapt this to whatever process you normally follow. Just taking the thing that you're going to represent on paper and starting out with like a 5-minute time slot, and you're only going to make 20 lines to represent that image. And then you're going to slightly reduce the time down to, let's say, 4 minutes and 3 minutes and 2 minutes, making fewer and fewer lines each time until ultimately you're just making 3 lines and you're doing it in 15 seconds. So it's this real challenge of thinking about like mark making, and that's why when I talk about mark making, that teacher just went on and on about mark making, so that's where this sort of phrase has come from. And it's really stuck with me. So thinking about the marks that you're making and why you're choosing to make them, and it's an instinctive process. Don't like analytically think too hard about it, but just do it, and then see what comes out of that basically. And it's uncomfortable. I mean, like for some of you maybe it's not, but for me, I found it uncomfortable to only be I just want to make more marks, and I'm like, but add that bit and this and so then like forcing yourself into like the idea you're ultimately just going to put 3 lines down on a piece of paper quite quickly to represent the thing in front of you, but in a very intentional way, not in like giving up whatever random way, is really interesting. And again, because I was doing human form, it's how you're conveying that sense of a person, and it's amazing. In like 20 lines you could like really convey a lot about the person standing in front of you.
Hmm.
Lines you could like really convey a lot about the person standing in front of you.
Hmm.
In the marks that you make. The other exercise where I suggest giving yourself a minimum of 30 minutes, maybe like 2 hours or a really long period of time, to make like a really comprehensive image, is you will close your eyes when you're making marks on the kind of paper or whatever canvas you're using, and then open your eyes, look at the thing that you're looking at, close your eyes, make marks. So you're never making marks with your eyes open. You're only opening your eyes to look at the thing that you're then going to make marks about, and then when you're closing your eyes to make the marks, you are you obviously have your eyes open when you get your pen close to the paper, so you're not drawing on the wall, but you're then going to have to instinctively visualize in your mind what you looked very hard at. And I found that like not only did this make me loosen up a bit in terms of how the thing that I'm drawing ended up looking, like just being less afraid of it looking like bad or not like the thing in front of me, and not being obsessive about that, but also it forced me to look way better, and to like not just look in little increments. Like I would look at a bit of detail and then mark that detail down, and then you get a bit lost in like details connecting together in a slightly warped way, is you like look at the kind of the big pattern of the way the image sits and the smaller details and how they fit together and where they are, and looking at the negative spaces. So for people who don't know what that means, like imagine you've got a person standing in front of you with their hand on their hip, looking at exactly the geometric shape of the hole, like through the gap between their arm and their body, and like then thinking about how that shape is going to fit onto the piece of paper. And it just improved. It improved my drawing, my confidence. It was a really great exercise. So that's my little homework for you to go have a go at, basically.
I like that. And the second part of that made me think, because I've talked about this on the podcast before, where, and I see myself doing it now, but I will be working on a piece. Let's say I'm drawing the eye of a bird. While I'm doing that, I'm looking at its feet. I'm not even looking where I'm drawing. And I don't know if that's confidence in work or if that's just I've got that personality that just needs to be I need a bunch of things happening at the same time. But I found that now that I've gotten to that point, I mess up sometimes. I'll go look back at where I'm actually drawing, and it's like, oh, that wasn't a good idea what I just did there, and I have to lift the graphite off, or I have to adjust it with if I'm using watercolor. But I find I'm doing that, and I think that maybe speaks to this idea of maybe also not being so bound to your tool touching the paper, that you need to liberate yourself away from that experience and understand that it's a larger piece that you're working on and enjoy the experience. And now that I see myself doing that, I'm kind of embracing it a little bit more. And I don't even think about it, except that I look back and I realize I made the mistake, and it's like, oh, I was doing it again, wasn't I? And so I really like that exercise. I mean, both are great, but the second one was like, that would be fun to do a whole image without actually looking at the paper when you were doing anything, right?
Yeah.
So, or doing everything. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, like, in theory, if you're disciplined about it, you could make marks whilst looking at the thing and not at your piece of paper, I suppose. It's
Yes.
the same kind of idea.
Yeah, but kind
But
of
yeah,
the
I
line
mean,
contour stuff. Yeah.
the teacher who kind of set me this work at the time and was my teacher, he was very of the mindset that like you just make marks and don't never take any away, never see any as bad, never see things as mistakes, or like he like banned, there were no erasers in the whole art department. Like like everyone just goes out there and you make marks and you feel liberated in your mark making. And it wasn't in any way that he was highly in favor of more abstract work. Like he let us I did loads of portraiture and more realism down the kind of portraiture road. And it was just this, like, just make marks and be confident with it, and those marks are expressions, and don't hate them, don't judge them, don't see them as one is better than another one, just go with them and be a bit more liberated. And largely I try to stick with that. I still now do sometimes revert back to my like, oh no, that looks bad, we need to let's retract it. And one of the things that's fun with digital art is retracting is so easy. Like you can just, Control Z for those people who don't do digital art. You're still familiar with computers. Like you can Control Z your drawing. Like I wish I could Control Z my painting sometimes. And yeah, with oil painting, that or any I imagine watercolors probably terrifying. You can't take it away at all. But yeah, then my mum, who is very much of the traditional kind of art background, I'm very fortunate to have her around, and she's my final like when, I don't know if you know about like chefs in fine restaurants will make the food, and then the top chef will like okay the plate before it goes out to the customer. She's like my top chef. So like before the painting gets released into the world, she'll like okay it. And in that process, she is like ruthlessly honest, and I love it. And she'll just be like, this bit doesn't look good. This bit doesn't look realistic. That foot, that's not believable. That wing, like, and often, always pretty much she's right. And part of me's gone like, okay, I'm done. Thank God I can put the paintbrush down. You have that moment of like, and then I have to go back and get my palette out and remix and go and fix the bit. But it's just incredibly valuable, and I feel so lucky to have that brutal honesty and that second person's eyes on it to kind of proofread as such the final draft of the painting. And like that big Kakapo painting we were talking about, like the shadow on the bird was like way too dark in one place, and she totally pulled me up on that, and I was like, oh, that's quite a lot of work to fix. Oh, really? Do I have to accept this? But she was right, and it's obviously worth it, for the sake of a few more hours in the studio to get it to that place where there aren't, where it looks as it should. You know, the light looks like it's falling the right way on the bird. So yeah, no, that's great.
It's fantastic that I think it highlights throughout your whole life that you've had some degree of a network around you, whether it was the kids in school, the five of you in a flat, uh, your mom, the tutor nearby, the high school teacher. You've always had people that you can lean on. I think that's important as a creative to make sure that you kind of surround yourself with a network. It doesn't have to be huge, but it has to be applicable for that point in your career, right, in your journey. So
Yeah.
it's
And
good
it's
that
a
you have that.
privilege. Like, so I'm fundamentally, objectively a privileged person who has benefited from that throughout my life, and I'm very aware of that, and incredibly grateful for all of the opportunities and support that I've had, which is not a given that everyone will have that.
Right.
But yeah, if you don't have those people automatically in your life, you know, you can seek them out. Certainly my friends in my 20s came out of nowhere. I mean, I found them like on the internet, literally like, you know, like online dating for flatmates is how we all met each other. That was it. That's the only connection between any of us. And yet we came together and are still good friends now, and a really lovely group of people. So, but no, I feel very grateful and fortunate that I've had the support that I've had throughout my life. Yeah, for sure.
That's wonderful. So I think it would be maybe appropriate for us to share where people can find you online and where you inhabit the nooks and crannies of the interwebs the most. So maybe you can start maybe with your website.
Yes, so my website is annagibbsart.com, and my Instagram is at annagibbsart. And I think that's probably, now, other than now that I'm on this podcast, that is probably where you're going to find me. If you find me on Facebook or Twitter, don't get too excited. Those things may still exist out there because I failed to delete them, but nothing's going to happen on there. I'm not really actively using them. And at the moment, my whole approach really is that everything I do is to facilitate me spending the time making the paintings. And so I probably anticipate one day I will get into teaching, and one day I will get into making prints, and one day I'll get into doing all sorts of other things, and probably more podcasts and whatever. But mostly my real focus is on just maximizing the amount of time and energy I can put into making the paintings, and then I will do all the other things I need to do, like Instagram and galleries and stuff to facilitate that. But yeah, the focus is very much to maximize the time in the studio. And so that is, I apologize for my lack of existence in more online spaces as it stands, and that will probably evolve over time. But yeah, at the moment it's mostly just focused on me in the studio as much as I can get that to happen.
That's absolutely fine. I think you will be on YouTube now, so that'll be good.
Exactly, there we go.
The next time you're asked to be on a podcast, people will have something to reference, so that'll be great.
Yeah.
So this has been absolutely wonderful. I know that it's a good podcast when I get to the end and I just want to go paint or draw, and I feel like that now. And I thank you for being so open about the challenges you've had with mental health, and in sharing your process and your journey and how you got to this point in time, and just the wonderful success you've had in the 3.5 years that, since we've had COVID. You've chosen probably the toughest time to not only start a family, but to start painting seriously. And I admire just your wonderful kind of view of the world that comes out through your painting, but also just this strength in being able to say, I'm just going to do the thing, and you do it. And so it's been a wonderful opportunity to be able to speak with you. I would love to have you back on in the future as your journey tends to meander and you hit new things. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for saying yes to coming on.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me and hosting me. Yeah, it's been a real honor.
Thanks again, and take care of yourself and enjoy I guess you're coming up to spring?
Yeah, yeah, oh
Yeah.
yeah. Today is very much spring is arriving in New
Nice.
Zealand.
Yeah, I think our high tomorrow is going to be over 30 degrees Celsius. Really weird for October for us. But then it's dropping down to like 12 degrees. So our fall, our leaves are
Yeah.
red. It's changing over. But I was thinking as I was setting up for this, it's like, oh, I can appreciate. I love fall. It's my favorite season.
Yeah, it's my favorite. I love fall. So,
But
like a sunny, cool day in
yes,
fall is just amazing.
it
Yeah,
is. The colors in the forest are just
yeah,
incredible. Yeah.
beautiful. Yeah,
Yeah. All right, Anna. Well, take care of yourself, and thanks
yeah.
again
Thank you
for
so
being on the
much.
podcast. Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.